6 months, I have been studying a set of part books released in 1568 called the Novi Pisari Musici at Baltimore's historical music library, the Riebenschneider Bach Institute. The part books contain sacred polyphonic choral music written in Latin, also known as motets. These motets, like all music from this period, are notated in white mensural notation. White mensural notation is the notational system used from the 13th to the 16th century that establishes the exact rhythmic value by the shape of the noteheads and created the foundation of the notation we use today. As this is no longer the notation system we use, scholars have been transcribing these pieces into modern editions to create performable repertoire since the 1960s. In this presentation, I will talk about how I used the Riebenschneider Bach Institute's Novi Pisari Musici to transcribe a motet by Mathias Zaphelius into a modern edition and discuss the challenges of the transcription process. The Novi was compiled by Pietro Giovanelli in 1568 and given as a gift to Emperor Maximilian II in condolences to his predecessor's death, Emperor Ferdinand I. The Novi was a series of 6 motet part books written for the cantus, quintus, sextus, altus, tenor, and bassus. The part books contain 254 motets written by 35 different composers, which includes the composer for Dederunt Apostoli, Mathias Zaphelius. We know very little about Mathias Zaphelius, except that he was a singer and composer from Austria. While his birth and death dates are unclear, based on documentation recorded from the University of Vienna and the Graz Court Chapel, we know that he was active between the years of 1550 and 1572. Scholars have only been able to locate 8 of his major works, all of which are motets and can be found in the Novi. Of those 8 pieces, only 2 of them have been transcribed into modern editions, Cum vidicete Beatus Andreas and Veni Redemptor Gentium. As I began transcribing and looking at the primary sources, I focused on the clefs, note values, ligatures, and measure lines. In the white mensural notation period, they notated clefs differently from our understanding of clefs. Specifically, in modern notation, the soprano and alto line are always notated in G clef, while the tenor and bass lines are generally notated in F clef. Throughout the Renaissance, each line was notated in a clef in order to keep the melodic line on the staff. Therefore, before I started doing any work with the transcription, I had to understand where to find middle C on each clef in order to accurately have a melodic line. Each vocal line is represented on this table as the clef it was originally notated in versus what I switched it to for it to make sense to a modern ensemble. However, this is when I ran into issues with the voicing of Dederunt Apostoli. Zaphelius wrote the bassus part in a C clef, which is usually written for a tenor voice, making the bassus line incredibly low, with most notes sitting below the bass clef staff. After researching this further, I discovered that this bassus part is written in a kievet, or a higher key. The research isn't unified on how to address the kievet. Some scholars recommend you transpose the piece, while others recommend you leave the piece as is. I determined the best way to address the kievet was to take the bassus line up an octave and find a bass voice with a large range. After determining the correct clef in which to read each vocal line, notating each line of music was quite straightforward. Using Renaissance notation manuals and the 2 other Zaphelius modern editions as references, I determined the value of specific notes. The value of notes were easy to transcribe except for when it came to ligatures in the piece. The ligatures, or notation symbols that combine 2 or more pitches together, were tricky to determine because scholars are not entirely clear what they represent. Despite how similar they look to a basic minima or semi-brevis, ligatures follow their own set of rules in Renaissance music theory. The value of a ligature is determined by how the shapes of a ligature are connected and the placement of the stem. In Dederunt Apostoli, there are 2 ligatures within the quintus and tenor parts. Measure lines were one of the trickiest decisions within this process. In white mensural notation, measure lines were not used to determine the breakdown of the time signature. Thus, I had to discover how to make the series of notes fit in the set of divisions Zaphelius did not account for when composing the piece. This process revolved around seeing where chords did not line up harmonically when placed into measure lines. At the end of the piece, the cantus, quintus, and bassus ended in measure 58, while the altus and tenor ended in measure 59. I made the decision to conclude all parts in place of fermata over measure 58 because there's no movement in the voices past measure 57. Throughout measure 58, all parts were sustaining one pitch for different values of time. In the Renaissance period, all parts would have concluded at the same point, and the reason each part finished on a different beat in the modern edition was because we added measure lines to the piece. Now that the transcription process of Dederunt Apostoli has been completed, here is a brief example of the results. This example was recorded on January 31st of this year at my senior recital when Dederunt Apostoli made its 21st century premiere. Throughout the Renaissance, choirs would adapt these motets to best suit the choir they had. Therefore, when you hear this recording, you'll hear the tenor line being sung by a soprano as we adapted the piece to best fit the ensemble we had. After completing this transcription process, I will begin looking at other pieces in the Novi, including other Zaphelius pieces, to find out which implement the use of the higher key to further understand how to use the key event. To hear Dederunt Apostoli in its entirety and learn more about the white mensural notation transcription process, the Virtuosic Vocal Chamber Ensemble Ampersand and I will be doing a presentation at Bach Festival on Friday, April 17th at 4 p.m. in Fines Hall. Ampersand will also be performing Dederunt Apostoli on April 17th at 7 p.m. in Gamble Auditorium, along with other transcribed works from the part books. As I move forward in this research, the next steps will be crucial to helping find a more well-rounded sound for the Renaissance period and finding pieces that have been lost in translation for 5 centuries. Thank you.